Good day everyone, welcome to today's lesson. Today we will be looking at map projections and coordinate systems. We begin by looking at a definition of map projections. What exactly is a map projection? A map projection is a method of transferring the location of features from the Earth's curved surface onto a flat map surface. This projection is usually a mathematical method that would allow you to transfer the location of those features that would be on that three-dimensional surface, which is the Earth, onto that flat two-dimensional surface, which is your map. So it's a transference of information from one dimension to another. Okay, now it's important for us to know this in GIS because in GIS we work essentially with flat surfaces. So our maps that we integrate into GIS are flat surfaces, and in order to overlay them and have some measure of accuracy and alignment, we need to be aware of what map projections were used. And as we go along through today's lesson, you will understand why we need to know map projections. So across the Earth we use different types of map projections. Different countries use different map projections. The larger the landmass that a country that belongs to a country, the greater the likelihood that you will have multiple map projections. And each map projection will have distortions of map features in different ways. So the projections may be different because the projection source, that is the origin from which you are projecting your features from that curved surface to the flat map surface, that could be different. That point of origin is what we refer to as our datum, and sometimes this datum or point of origin may change. Alright, and this may change from datum to datum and location to location. So if you follow with me on the diagram below here, this circle represents our three-dimensional Earth surface. This line represents our two-dimensional map surface. This point at the middle here would be our datum or projection source. So follow carefully with me. Any features you have on the Earth's surface here, if we begin at our datum and we draw a line through that point on the Earth's surface and continue extending that point to the map surface, we can now locate that same feature here on the three-dimensional surface is now represented here on our map surface. So this is essentially conceptually how the process of projection works. So I mentioned that different projections can have different distortions. Here we have some examples of the world map using various projections, and if you look, you should be able to clearly see that there are differences in the map. For example, if you compare our Mercator projection with the Gaulle-Peters projection, you can see the Gaulle-Peters projection, you can see some elongation towards the north and the south of the land masses, whereas to the left, your Mercator projection, you can see that it is widened east and west. Similarly, if you look at some of the other maps, you see some differences. Compare the Miller cylindrical projection with the Mercator. Now it looks very similar, but if you look carefully, you would see landmass sizes are different. So here shape has been distorted. The difference between these two, you can see differences in land area. Okay, and these are some other types of projections that have been used as well. So you can see minor differences amongst all of them. So this is what we talked about on the previous slide, where we talked about different datum can lead to different map projection results. So we can place map projections into three categories. Map projections can be cylindrical, that would be represented by this figure here. It may be conic. Conic is the one in the center, or it may be planar, which would be this figure here on the diagram. Now, cylindrical, imagine you have a cylinder encircling the earth. If you follow with me on this diagram, imagine this is the North Pole and this is the South Pole. What we would find is, if we were to open up this cylinder to see the results of how the features have been transferred, what you would have found is the features that would have made contact with the cylinder around the center or the equator, those would now be perfectly transferred onto your map. So it is important for us to know where point of contact is in this case, because usually your point of contact would be your areas of greatest accuracy on your map, or your features of greatest accuracy. Similarly, with the conic, we see that we have a different projection system being used. So now we have a cone. Now just bear in mind, the cone could be fitted from above, that's in the northern hemisphere, or it can be done from below in the southern hemisphere. Our point of contact, if you follow with the arrow, seems to be in the northern hemisphere, typically along your mid latitudes. Alright, if it had been done from the southern hemisphere, it would have been around the mid latitudes in the southern hemisphere. So again, your point of contact would be the features that will have the greatest accuracy. Similarly, here we have a plane, hence the reason we call it planar. Your point of contact would have the greatest accuracy here. So as mentioned, point of contact, this is where you would have the least amount of distortions of features on your map. So it's important for us to know some of these things, so we would know what level of accuracy and what types of accuracy we have regarding our map features. So what types of errors may be introduced into your data depending on the map projection that you use? For example, distances between objects may be preserved, but the direction of features from one another, or the shape of the features, may be distorted at the expense, or I beg your pardon, accuracy of one characteristic might be preserved at the expense of something else, right? So you can have distances preserved at the expense of shape or expense of areas of the features, etc. So the point that you have to remember is that quite often there is no one projection system that gets the transference of those features onto the flat surface perfectly 100% correct. Okay, so what are our properties of projections? When we are assessing or evaluating a projection, these are the things that we look for. We look to determine whether the features are area preserving. In other words, is it preserving the area of the features? It could be equidistant. For example, is it preserving distances between features? Azimuthal, is it preserving angles and directions between features or amongst features? Or is it preserving the shape? Conformal. So these are the four main properties of projection. These are the things that you would look for to make an evaluation of the projection results. So if you recall, in one of the earlier slides we talked about the cylindrical projections. So one thing I would want you to remember, or to note rather, remember we said we saw where in the previous slide the point of contact where we get the greatest accuracy. We saw, for example, it would be around the equator area. So for example, that would be suitable for making maps of small areas such as island features in the Caribbean. So this is ideal for island features such as in our area. So it's commonly used around the equator region. Right here again we have a specific example of cylindrical projection. Specifically, this projection name is transverse Makita projection. You may be familiar with that one. So here's an example of how it's used. Notice the orientation of the cylinder is also different this time. Okay, so your point of contact runs north to south, and when that has been unwrapped to show the results on our two-dimensional surface or our flat surface, this is what it would look like. Okay, so remember, every feature that falls along that red line, which is our point of contact, we can assume is accurate. Secondly, we had our conic projection. If you recall, I said this works best in mid-latitudes. It's also generally good for large areas or large land masses. An example of this is the Lambert conformal conic projection. So again, if you look here, you see it has been applied to the northern hemisphere. You see our red lines, which would be our point of contact. Now what you're actually looking at here is 3 different applications, hence the reason you have 3 red lines. Alright, again, this is what the map would look like when it has been completed. This is a 2-dimensional map. Then we have our azimuthal or planar projection. Remember, it's just a surface that we are projecting to this time, a flat surface. So this places a plane over a specific point on the Earth's surface, and typically this is used for polar charts or polar maps. And this is because you will have distortions occurring in other latitudes. So an example of this is a name of an example, azimuthal equidistant projection. So this is what the projection process would look like, and this is the resultant map. So this point here at the what appears to be the North Pole is where you would have greatest accuracy. Okay, now this chart here is really just a summary of what we talked about before. Here we have all 3 categories of projections, and we have a summary of the characteristics of each on this side. So I'm not going to spend time going through that with you. That would be for your purpose of revision and review of the topic. So let's move on. Now I want to talk about coordinate systems. So I need for you to bear in mind that coordinate systems are different from map projections. If you recall, a map projection is a process of transferring features from a 3-dimensional surface such as the Earth, the surface of the Earth, to a 2-dimensional surface such as flat maps. Right? So it's a process of transferring information. A coordinate system, on the other hand, is a system of numbers used to determine position or location. So it's different, right? For example, we have Universal Transverse Makita, UTM. Many of you would have heard of that or may be familiar with the use of it. Another coordinate system would be our latitude and longitude. This one also represents location in the form of degrees, minutes, and seconds. So hopefully those are the 2 main ones that you all are familiar with. Okay, so we're still talking about coordinate systems. Now we want to distinguish between projected coordinate systems and geographic coordinate systems. So again, we do a little recap. Remember, we refer to the Earth as a 3-dimensional object. The features on the 3-dimensional object, which is the Earth, those are what we transfer to the flat surface, which is the map, right, during the process of map projections. Now a geographic coordinate system, right, so it's a coordinate system, but it's geographic because it locates positions on the 3-dimensional surface, that is the Earth's surface, in the form of latitude and longitude, right? So it's geographic and not projected because it is locating features on that 3-dimensional surface. The projected coordinate system, on the other hand, locates the position of features on that 2-dimensional flat surface, And an example of that projected coordinate system is UTM. And UTM would be represented using eastings and northings. Alright, so if you right, so we're continuing. Again, for the geographic coordinate systems, we represent location using latitude and longitude, which actually measures angles, right? And as mentioned before, it's expressed in degrees, minutes, and seconds. The projected coordinate system, which locates on the 2D surface, as mentioned before, this is just reinforcement of the information here. It uses universal transverse Mercator. Instead of measuring location using angles, it actually uses distances. So UTM actually uses meters. And the map, you would usually tend to find gridded lines which are angular in nature. So here we have some visual examples for you to distinguish between the two. Here we have a map which utilizes geographic coordinate systems. And how would you know? If you look carefully at your x and y axis, your y here and your x, you would actually see each one of these lines are actually degrees represented here, right? The projected coordinate system map, or UTM map, this is what we're looking at. You see we have eastings here along your x-axis and northings along your y-axis. Bear in mind your eastings are actually the vertical lines that are read east and west. Okay, notice it's decreasing this way. Your northern lines are actually your horizontal lines that are read north and south of the equator. Notice it's increasing to the north. Right, so very quickly, we'll look at some common map projections that we use in GIS. For example, we have the Lambert conformal conic projection. As mentioned before, this is suitable for large areas. So, for example, we have some countries that have large land masses, such as North America, Russia, China. All right, these are all in the northern hemisphere. So we know that the conic projection system would be suitable for these countries. We have the transverse Mercator, we know is cylindrical. As mentioned before, it would be suitable for around the equator and small island areas such as the Caribbean. This particular projection maintains and preserves scale, shape, area, and bearing. So those are a lot of characteristics or properties that are actually preserved using the cylindrical for small areas. Then we have our universal transverse Mercator projection. Now, the universal transverse Mercator projection, this is a global coordinate system. All right, the UTM projection is a global coordinate system. Remember, the coordinate system allows us to identify exact locations. But this global one actually divides the Earth into zones of 6 degrees in longitudinal width, right? Those are the vertical lines. And many zones have been developed. So it's usually important for you to know the particular country that you are interested in or that you live in. You want to know what zone that belongs to. So the next slide we will actually identify Trinidad and Tobago zone. Okay, so this universal transverse Mercator projection is commonly used for large data sets and large study areas covering large geographic areas. So you're talking about, for example, large geographic regions such as the Caribbean or the Americas, or if you're even looking at maps on a global scale, you would want to use this UTM projection, right? So as mentioned before, distances would be specified in meters north and east of the zone of origin, and at the previous slide I already showed you how to read those UTM maps. All right, So here are the zones, the UTM zones I was referring to, and you will see the zone numbers along the y-axis as well as along the x-axis. Okay, so Trinidad and Tobago is actually located in zone 20P. 20, you can find that along the x-axis, and it's P if you read along the y-axis. Okay, so let's talk about spatial referencing systems now. So we have features on the Earth's surface are located using our referencing system. Now, we would actually, as we continue to talk about this topic, we would actually discover that the coordinate systems that we talked about previously are examples of spatial referencing system, right? So they're used to locate features on the Earth's surface. Characteristics of referencing systems should have the ability to show points, lines, and polygons or area features. Alright, so in other words, every single part of that feature, be it a point, a line, or an area feature, we must be able to identify a precise location using this referencing system. The referencing system should also have the ability to measure length, areas, and shape of the features. Alright, so you must be able to use this referencing system to derive that kind of information about features from your map. Now, referencing systems can be grouped into three categories. We have geographic coordinate systems, which we looked at already. We have rectangular coordinate systems, or in other words, projected coordinate systems, which we also looked at. Remember, geographic was using latitude and longitude. Projected coordinate systems, we used UTM. And then we also have a third category called non-coordinate systems. So how or why are spatial referencing systems important in GIS? This is important because if you recall, the whole premise or the whole utility of GIS is the ability to overlay maps within the same geographic space of different features to see how those features are related to each other. So if you did not have an accurate spatial referencing system to locate those features, the whole process of overlay would be messy and inaccurate because you would not be able to align the maps correctly. Right? So, as mentioned before, we have looked already at two examples of spatial referencing system, which is our geographic coordinate system, such as latitude and longitude, and our projected coordinate system, such as UTM. Okay, in GIS, if you have different coordinate systems, it's possible for you to transform your map from one coordinate system to another because there are utilities in GIS that would allow you to do that. Okay, so let's look briefly at some examples of non-coordinate systems. One very common one that most of us may be familiar with would be the postal code system. The postal code system is really descriptive codes, usually using letters or numbers or a combination of both, that would allow you to approximate the location of a building or an address. So it's a little bit different from the coordinate systems we've looked at before, which has the ability to give you a precise location. Whereas postal code system can give you an approximation in terms of streets, where you have street intersections, in terms of a small geographic area, etc. But it does not give you the ability to locate precise locational points. Then we also have other examples of non-coordinate systems. We have our Euclidean distance. Many of you may be familiar with Pythagoras' theorem. So this is essentially how it works. So if you follow on the diagram, you can see it's you can determine the distance here using your x and y coordinates and that distance between the 2 points is calculated. Then we have another example of non-coordinate system, which is a Manhattan distance. This one generates distance along routes. So again, this diagram here gives you an idea of how that would look, right? So essentially, from this point here, point A to point B, that distance would be calculated along a route. Okay, so this one would be more applicable, for example, in urban areas where you will have to calculate distances along roadways, because it would not be practical to have straight line distances calculated. And then we also have our Cartesian coordinates, which calculates the distance between 2 points using Cartesian coordinates. So this graph here should look familiar to most of you. All right, again, we have our y-axis increasing from 0 to 10, our x-axis from 0 to 15, and we can determine the coordinate location here. So if you look at it, you see our x actually is approximately 12, right? Hence the reason we have 12 here, and our y is at 5. So our location is actually coordinates 12, 5. So what are some of the problems associated with spatial referencing systems? In other words, remember, referencing systems allow us to locate an object on the Earth's surface. Problem essentially is with the aspect or the characteristic of mobility of some spatial features. For example, how do you locate animals, people, etc. Now we do have new technologies that are moving very quickly towards allowing integration of dynamic location updates into GIS. Okay, but those technologies have been allowing us to do that. For example, the police, national security, they would have technologies that allow you to do things like that, vehicle tracking, etc. Then you have other problems associated with the spatial referencing systems, from the perspective that spatial entities may change over time. For example, we know that roads may be relocated, land use boundaries may be redefined. So when these changes take place, it means that the location information on a map must also be updated. It's not something that automatically is updated. Next, the referencing system. The spatial referencing system could present a problem if the same object is referenced differently on different occasions. For example, you can have a house that may be referenced and represented as a point or as a polygon area. Now that can be applicable when you look at differences in scale. If you zoom in, you may see a house as an area feature. If you zoom out to a smaller scale where you see more information but less detail, the house would now look like a point. So now the location would actually be referenced differently because the scale has changed. Okay, so very briefly, earlier we talked about datum. I want to talk just a little bit more information about datum, or specifically geodetic datum, sorry. So as mentioned before, the datum defines the size and the shape of the Earth. That's the origin, the point of origin. So it is the origin and orientation of the coordinate system used, in other words, as a set of mathematical parameters and ground control points that will define a local coordinate system. So what I want you to bear in mind is the datum influences the results of the coordinate system. So when we reference a coordinate system by name, that name should also include the datum from which it was derived. Now this is important to know, as we said before, because you have hundreds of datum that can be used, and particularly if you're from a large country or a large region, you will have a larger number of datum. Okay, so the reason that you will have various datum is because you would want to have localized datum for your coordinate system, because it tends to improve the level of accuracy as opposed to using a more large scale one. Now if you reference the wrong geodetic coordinates to the wrong datum, this can lead to positional errors in your data. Alright, so what I want you to note at the bottom of this slide, the name of the datum that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. We have Trinidad has the Naparima 1955 and Tobago has the Naparima 1972. Right, so each one has a local datum. Now if you bear in mind in one of the previous slides, when we're working with larger areas, we would tend to use UTM. Now World Geographic System UTM, that's what we would use. But when we're working on a localized scale and you want greater accuracy, you would use the local datum, which would be Naparima 1955 and Naparima 1972. So here's a visual of what we're talking about. So the black line represents the Earth's surface. The blue line represents that global datum that I just mentioned, WGS 84, that is World Geographic System 84. So that is a global datum. And then the red broken line is a local datum. So if you look at it, when you overlay these, you see that there are actually differences in location. They do not line up perfectly. For example, the average difference between WGS 84 UTM, which is a global, and the local one for Trinidad, Naparima 1955, you'd find that there is an offset of about between 200 to 400 meters. So this is why you need to be aware of what datum you're using, because if you're using different layers and overlaying layers with different datum, you will have a problem with alignment. And finally, this is an example of what a properly written coordinate system would look like. Here we have Naparima 1955 UTM, zone 20P. This is for Trinidad. So the Naparima 1955 refers to our datum. Our coordinate system is UTM. And of course, we also reference the zone that we belong to. So I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please continue on to today's activity. Thank you.